Convidamos você que nos acompanha a fazer parte da Legião da Santa Cruz. Acesse www.legiãodasantacruz.com/filiação. O link também estará disponível na descrição do vídeo. Filie-se e lute pelo reinado social de Nosso Senhor Jesus Cristo. Viva Cristo Rei! Saudações a você que acompanha a Legião da Santa Cruz. Hoje estamos aqui em um LegioCast muito especial com o escritor britânico Joseph Pearce. Joseph Pearce é inglês e converteu-se ao catolicismo nos anos 80, graças aos escritos de D.K. Chesterton. Desde então, ele se tornou uma autoridade nos escritos de autores católicos de língua inglesa, como Tolkien, o próprio Chesterton, C.S. Lewis e Oscar Wilde. Atualmente, ele é um membro do corpo docente da Universidade de Ave Maria, na Flórida, e tem 3 livros publicados em português, incluindo o último lançamento, Literatura, o que todo católico deve saber. Pois bem, to start, Mr. Pearce, thank you for it's truly an honor to have you here with us today. To start, please tell us about your latest translated book, Literature, and why should Brazilians read it?
Well, the book was written basically as a way of people seeing the full landscape of literature from the time of Homer right through to the 20th century, so right through to writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien. So for people that feel that they don't know literature as well as they should, and I think that's many of us, this is a good book as an introduction to the whole panorama, the whole landscape. And I think that obviously there's a tendency towards Anglophone literature, to literature in the English language, because that's obviously what my speciality is, but certainly not exclusively. So I mean, obviously there's Homer, Virgil, Dante, Manzoni, Cervantes. There's chapters on French literature, Russian literature. It does endeavor at least to touch most of the bases of the most important works of literature that have been produced by Western civilization since the time of Homer, more than 2,500 years ago now.
Mr. Pearce, to start on our first more specific question, we're going to venture into the political already, because we're a political group, so we're very interested about the economic issues. And I would say that the Brazilian Catholic reader is kind of tired of being presented libertarianism as the only economical alternative to 20th century socialism by the mainstream. For that reason, interest in economists other than economists of the Austrian and Chicago schools has grown a lot recently, including interest in economists of the national and historical schools of economics, but also interest on the distributists, of course, has skyrocketed. And this brings us to, of course, G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, but also to the lesser-known distributists, so to speak, because I suppose everybody knows, or everybody has heard, or most people, I should say, have heard of Chesterton and Belloc, but not so many about E.F. Schumacher. So you haven't written a book about him. Please help us introduce this author, his works, and his thought to the Brazilian public. Please tell us a little bit about him.
Yes, so E.F. Schumacher, if the Brazilian public don't know about him, it must be because his best-selling book from the early 1970s, Small is Beautiful, was not as popular perhaps in the the Portuguese-speaking world as it was in the English-speaking world. But back in the early 1970s, E.F. Schumacher, who is a German economist who spent most of his life in England, he began as a communist and then a Marxist economist who realized that Marxism did not have the answers to the problems, that centralizing all economic power into the hands of politicians was not an efficient or effective way of running the economy. So he published a book in the early 1970s called Small is Beautiful, Economics If People Mattered. And this was hugely influenced actually by Catholic social teaching, so by particularly the papal encyclicals, Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII and Quadragesimo Anno by Pope Pius XI. And it was largely due to Schumacher's being converted to a Catholic philosophical understanding of economics that led to his own conversion to Catholicism at around the time that he was finishing the writing of Small is Beautiful. This became a million seller. Millions of copies were sold, which for a book of economics was phenomenal. And really a large aspect of what we now would call localism, or a belief that economics should be, as far as possible, a healthy economy is rooted in many small businesses and not in a small number of large businesses, but that the absence of ownership is also detrimental to freedom. So therefore, widely distributed property, which of course is the nexus of distributist economics, that basically as many people as possible should have productive ownership of their own means of production, so that they're free from either state control or from control by what would now be global corporations. So a healthy economy is an economy where the local economy is very strong because it's comprised of numerous local businesses.
Did he give us any tips on how to achieve that?
Well, the most important thing is that it's the same thing applies in economics as applies in the moral life, that if you want to have a better economy, begin with yourself. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that that the battle between good and evil is taking place in each individual human heart. So this civil war happens in the first instance in each of our own individual souls, and so we have to live virtuously, and that includes living virtuously in the sense of our economic engagement. So let me give you some practical examples. That, for instance, that we need to be spending less of our income on globalist products, on high technological products. We don't have to buy the newest technological gadget as soon as it becomes available, for instance. We need to be prepared to spend more of our money on, for instance, food and locally produced goods, a larger portion of our income. So, for instance, we buy, my own family, buy all of our meat and vegetables, all our meat and produce from local farmers. The local farmers have got together and have formed a group called the Carolina Growers Group, and they have a store in the local main street. And we go there, it's like a cooperative, and we go there and buy the bulk of our food from local farmers. We try to avoid eating in chain restaurants. We eat in locally owned restaurants. In other words, we try to spend as much of our money as possible on the local economy and try to disengage ourselves as much as possible from the globalist economy. And then the other thing we do is to try to encourage other people to do the same. So if all of us began doing that and try to encourage each other to tell others to do this, we would be changing the economy for the better from the grassroots up, because we're not going to get the International Monetary Fund to do what they should. We're not going to get the global corporations to start living in accordance with what's best for both the economy, the environment, and the people. So we have to do it ourselves, and that means beginning with ourselves at grassroots level.
Very interesting. And if I may add, there's one small thing that I do, being a skeptical, of course, on banks, is to use local credit unions, to prefer credit unions. But I don't know if we can translate this to the Brazilian reality, in the sense that we have now in Brazil, following recent events, or one of the hardest economic recessions in a very long time, and a lot of people are struggling even to afford food. So how can we translate this to a reality where people are having to go to the butcher and ask for leftover bones to make a broth to try to subsist? How can we tell people you ought to not spend your money being consumerist when they're struggling to survive?
Yeah, well, insofar as that is literally true, then of course those individual families and those individuals have to make economic decisions based upon the necessities that appertain to them uniquely. And I'm certainly not trying to. The whole point, I'm not trying to prescribe a one-size-fits-all, but I am trying to prescribe something that if you have major economic recessions, what's the cause of that, and how ultimately do we have a sustainable economic future? And it's not ultimately going to be an economic future where all of our food is imported from other parts of the world, where all of our clothes are imported from other parts of the world, and the world basically being controlled by a combination of international financial institutions and global corporations and political empires. In other words, the largest and most powerful national governments becoming international unions such as the European Union. That is not a sustainable future. So we do have to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So, for instance, once I gave a talk on this, and someone said, "Well, some of my, some of my friends are very poor, and they can only afford to shop at these huge global chains such as Walmart." And my response was, well, if that's true, then so be it. Heaven forbid I'm going to suggest that someone should starve. I would say, however, that certainly in the United States, nobody is starving. That people that can't say they can't afford to spend more money on local products are quite happy to buy the latest iPhone. Of course, this is not necessarily applicable to Brazil. As I said, there's not a one-size-fits-all here, except there is a principle. The principle is that if we want a sustainable economic and political future, we have to find alternatives to buying into the globalist globalization and the international financial system and big government. And so we have to find alternatives. And at grassroots level, that can be done through cooperation. In other words, through producers cooperatives, consumers cooperatives, just people getting together to help each other. It's charity in the original Latin understanding of the word caritas, where we actually see ourselves as being in communion with each other and helping each other at local level. Helping our neighbors, the literal sense of our neighbors, those who live close to us.
Thank you, Mr. Pearce. Changing gears a little bit, our next question is more focused on literature itself, and it's actually a question about Shakespeare. And it may come as a little known fact to a lot of people who are educated on the basis of or taught in school that Shakespeare was a romantic or something of that sort, that he was actually a very devout Catholic, and that he imprinted Catholic meaning into his plays. Tell us a little bit more about Shakespeare. We want to know more about the greatest writer of the English language, and find out what he has to contribute to the Catholic world.
Well, yes, I've written 3 books on Shakespeare. There's just a chapter on Shakespeare in the new book, Literature What Every Catholic Should Know. But I've written 3 books on Shakespeare. The first was called The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome, which looks at the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism and gives the factual case for that in a way which I think is proven beyond any reasonable doubt. And then I wrote a book called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays. And this, if Shakespeare, if the documentary, biographical, historical evidence suggests Shakespeare's a Catholic, and we need to remember, of course, and by the way, that when Shakespeare was alive in the late 16th and early 17th century, the Catholic Church was illegal in England. The secularist regime of England basically has established a state religion, and the state religion was the only allowed religion. The Catholic Church had been outlawed. It was against the law to be a Catholic. It was punishable by death to be a Catholic priest. It was punishable by death to hide a Catholic priest from the authorities. So this is the world in which Shakespeare is living. So in that second book, Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays, I show how Shakespeare has a Catholic worldview, that philosophically, theologically, morally, he is presenting the case for Catholicism in a way that is subtle enough not to get him arrested, but in a way which is obvious enough, certainly for his own age, and also our own age, with a little bit of extra effort to understand the Catholic dimension in his plays and his poems. And then the third book on Shakespeare I wrote was called Shakespeare on Love, Discovering the Hidden Meaning of Romeo and Juliet, in which I show, again, a Catholic moral perspective on love, on marriage, on eros, sexual desire, and on the difference between love as understood by Christians, love as a rational choice, love as freely choosing to lay down our life for the beloved, versus the romantic understanding of love as merely something emotional and rooted in feeling, and therefore fundamentally irrational. Shakespeare shows the danger of following the latter path to the exclusion of the former, and that's the key component of the plot and the moral dynamic of Romeo and Juliet.
Again, about literature, and on another author right now who has seen increasing interest from the Brazilian public, and that we would love to hear more about, because you had the opportunity to interview him yourself. That is, of course, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Please give us some insight into the mind of this man, a man who was imprisoned by the communist regime, and who wrote true masterpieces. Please tell us more about him.
Yeah, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is one of the giants of the 20th century in terms of politics, in terms of economics, and in terms of literature. So he was imprisoned by the Soviet Union for the heinous crime of writing a basically mildly critical sentence or two about Joseph Stalin in private correspondence to a friend when he was serving in the Soviet army during World War II. And of course, under communism, there's no such thing as private correspondence. The state gave itself the authority to read everybody's mail. And in consequence, that letter was opened, and for the crime of writing in a private letter something critical of Joseph Stalin, he was sentenced to 7 years hard labor. His experience of being arrested, he saw as a great blessing. For Solzhenitsyn, suffering is necessary to wake us up from the lie into the fullness of truth. It's better to suffer than to live comfortably a lie. So he shows that in his life. When he got out of prison, became a very outspoken critic of the communist regime. Again, as with Shakespeare, something very dangerous, because it was punishable by death or certainly long prison sentences to openly criticize communism in the Soviet Union. But he wrote a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a short novel, a novella, about a typical day in the life of a prisoner in the Soviet labor camp system. And then he wrote The Gulag Archipelago, which was a monumental 3-volume expose of the tyranny and corruption of the Soviet Union and the millions of people that have been imprisoned and killed under Soviet communism. These works became bestsellers in the West, but were obviously illegal in the Soviet Union. And so they were handed out in the Soviet Union in what was known as samizdat. That's the sort of the Russian word for hand-copied manuscripts that are passed by hand to hand because the publishing of them was illegal. And then he became so well known in the West, it became difficult for the Soviets to actually to come down too harshly on him because everybody could see who he was. He'd become a celebrity. Although we do know that the KGB the Soviet secret police attempted to assassinate him in the early 1970s. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his work. He was forced into exile by the Soviet Union and spent 20 or so years in the West, mostly in the United States, always predicting that he would outlive the Soviet tyranny, and he was correct in this. So after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, he returned home to Russia. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Returned home to Russia in 1994 and spent the last 13 or so years of his life in his homeland. And it was there in his home just outside Moscow that I was honored to meet him and interview him in 1998 for my biography of him.
So there's a very interesting parallel, actually, between these two authors that are so far removed in time and in space, too, both Shakespeare and Solzhenitsyn.
Yes, well, we need to realize that there's a recurring motif, if you like, in human history between the Heiligergeist and the Zeitgeist, between the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of the Age. The Spirit of the Age is always basically secularist. It's putting the world and whatever is its current fashion, which will just be worldly, first, and putting the church and the truths of Christ second, if at all. So this, when I mentioned earlier, Solzhenitsyn's saying that the battle between good and evil takes place in every heart, every individual human heart. It also takes place in every individual human heart, in every human generation from the beginning of time. Because even if we go back as far as ancient Greece and to Sophocles' play Antigone, we see this conflict between secularism and the tyranny of the state, the tyranny of the secular state, and religious liberty, religious freedom. And Antigone chooses to lay down her life for religious freedom. Shakespeare was doing the same thing, 1800 years or so later, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and Solzhenitsyn was doing the same thing in the 20th century. So this battle between the power of the world and the prince of this world, ultimately Satan, and the timeless truths of God, this choice between living in the world in a worldly way or taking up our cross and following Christ is something which is part of the human condition every generation. So one of the beautiful things about literature is it shows us this timeless aspect of humanity and the choice we have to make between following God or following the secular fads and fashions of the day.
Absolutely. At many points in life, though, Solzhenitsyn was met with accusations of anti-Semitism due to some of his writings, some of which haven't even been translated yet to some Western languages as much to our chagrin, of course, because being a Nobel Prize literature laureate, you would expect all, if not most, of his works to have been translated. And what can you tell us about that? And if you have any familiarity with those works as well, if you could tell us anything about them, we would be interested to know, and about those absurd accusations as well.
Basically, the Solzhenitsyn is a very courageous writer, and he's very happy to take on thorny topics, but always from the perspective of Christian charity. So he did write a book about the relationship between the Jews and the Russians, and the Jews in Russia, and it's absolutely a work in which he treats both Jews and Russians with equal respect, as made in the image of God. The dignity of the human person is always at the heart and the center of everything Solzhenitsyn writes. So to accuse him of anti-Semitism is absolutely scandalous and outrageous. But obviously there's been tensions between the Jewish people living in Russia and between the Russian people, and those tensions have sometimes spilled over in ways that are not good. And what he wanted to do was to look at, well, why was that, and how can we avoid that happening in the future? It's a work of love for both Russia and for the Jews that lived in Russia, but it's a work of frankness and candor, but again, rooted in a Christian understanding of the dignity of the human person and in love for all of every human person as commanded by Christ.
A true love, that is, not love in the worldly sense, of course.
Yeah, basically the seeing in our neighbor and even in our enemy the image of God in the other person, because the other person is made in the image of God. Now, the person obviously is also, as indeed are we, prone to selfishness and wickedness and sin, and certainly we can become besotted with or drunk with bad ideas or bad lifestyles. And you know that Jane Austen, that great English novelist, when she wrote her book Pride and Prejudice, that title is full of wisdom, because pride always goes hand in hand with prejudice, because pride is the absence of humility. And if we do not have humility, we will not see things as they are. We will see things as we want them to be. And when we see things as we want them to be from our own prideful perspective, we don't see them as they are. We see them in a hideous, stereotypical caricature. So the whole politics of pride is riddled with prejudice. It's the politics of humility that sees things through the light of Christ, that understands reality for what it is.
Mr. Pearce, in Brazil at least, we can see an appropriation of Chesterton's works by some neoconservatives and even some Protestants nowadays, and they clearly defend a liberal form of economy. And these people, despite constantly quoting him in those things that might be considered somewhat more suitable to their beliefs, they yet dismiss all the connections between Chesterton's works and what the Catholic Church teaches. I would like you to go deeper into why we cannot separate the opinions of these authors from the intrinsic Catholicism.
So that's an extremely good question, and I will begin to answer it by reiterating what I said at the end of the my previous answer, that if we will not see with humility, we will see with pride. If we see with pride, we will see in a prejudiced way. So we will pick and choose what we want to see from Chesterton and not see the whole picture. Now, this happened to me. I mean, I am under grace a Catholic because of my reading of Chesterton. And at first, I was in denial about Chesterton's Catholicism. I wanted to pick and choose. I wanted to do what the neoconservatives and others want to do with Chesterton. I just wanted to like a cafeteria Chesterton lover, pick and choose from the shelf and leave the rest on the shelf. But I came to realize, when I was going to be honest with myself, that all of Chesterton's beliefs, his philosophical beliefs, his economic beliefs, his political beliefs, are a consequence of his Catholic beliefs. And he said, first of all, that he was a disciple of Belloc in this, that Belloc was, if you like, the prophet of distributism, which is basically Catholic social teaching made applicable to the economy. But Belloc was himself a disciple of both Pope Leo XIII and his encyclical Verum Novarum, and also the writings and example of Cardinal Manning, a major figure in the English Catholic Church at the end of the 19th century. So that you have to see Chesterton and Belloc's political and economic views in the integrity of their entirety. See it as a whole. And if you don't do that, you're not seeing it at all. You're basically only seeing your own very blinkered, short-sighted, prejudiced perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Pearce. And it's interesting to see that even some Protestant groups now, they try to convey Chesterton as a Protestant. And that's simply ridiculous.
Yes, it is. But let me say something, however, that I was at a conference this past weekend. I will not say the organization, but it's basically a Protestant organization that supports classical education, as opposed to sort of the state and relativistic education. And there was a play which looked at dialogue between Chesterton and Bernard Shaw they put on. These people are all reading Chesterton. And what you have to realize is that they are moving closer and closer to Catholicism. Now, it's dangerous for a Protestant to read Chesterton. And many, many thousands of non-Catholics, including, of course, many thousands of Protestants, have converted to Catholicism through their engagement with the writing of G.K. Chesterton, and myself included. And I could name many, many others. In fact, there's a book called My Name is Lazarus, published by the American Chesterton Society, which is a whole book of essays by people who came to Catholicism through their reading of Chesterton. So we shouldn't be too antagonistic towards the fact that Protestants are reading Chesterton. If, of course, they're claiming that Chesterton believed something which Chesterton didn't, then they are not, they're being either dishonest or they are not actually understanding Chesterton.
In this question, we, approach a little bit more of literature, but linking with more of a history, a more historic process that happened. So, as you mentioned, Shakespeare, and other literary authors from the 16th, the 17th centuries. Catholic authors was strong in these past centuries in literature. They had more presence, right? They were writing, they were producing, they were publishing. But in our days, we see that Catholic doctrine seems to be totally banished from literature. It's very difficult to find authors, to find publications in our days. So what we would like to know, like, what happened? What was the process? So when and how exactly did we cast out of this field? And what would be the key points to regain presence in literature? For an example, is it just a lack of production, or we would face trouble even accessing publishers and retailers if we got to, try to be more present in literature?
That's a very good question. Let me begin by answering historically. Chesterton says that the Catholic Church has died many times in its history, but has always risen again from the dead because it worships a God who knew the way out of the grave. So, in actual fact, in Shakespeare's time, the secular culture was much more antagonistic towards Catholicism than it is even today. I mean, they're not at the moment putting Catholics to death in England. And there was 300 years of persecution of the church from the 1530s until the 1680s in England, for the first 150 years of which priests and laity were being executed for their faith. So we need to remember that the church, as Christ promised, is always being persecuted by the world. He says, if they have persecuted me, they will persecute you. So we don't need to despair if we find ourselves living in a valley of tears and a land of exile. This is not heaven, and it's never going to be heaven. And each of us is merely serving our tour of duty in the church militant. In other words, we're all soldiers for Christ for our period on earth. We don't know how long that's going to be, but if we are loyal and courageous and virtuous in our fighting for the church militant, we will be with Christ forever in heaven, and that is infinitely and eternally larger than this temporal period in which we find ourselves. So I want to put that context. And so when the Catholic Church, it's seen that had been exterminated in England, we have in the 19th century, beginning with the neo-medievalism, which was a consequence of Romanticism, a Catholic revival, which came to fruition with the conversion of St. John Henry Newman in 1845, and then a huge increase in the number of Catholics in England throughout the 19th century, a number of Catholic schools, number of Catholic churches, number of people practicing the faith. So when we see another period of decline, which we've certainly seen since the 1960s, then we should see it in this bigger perspective. Now, as regards today, there are two things I would say. We are finding ourselves in a very secular culture, a secular fundamentalist culture, which is intolerant of Christianity. So in many respects, Catholic culture, contemporary Catholic culture, so Catholic writers, authors, poets, Catholic artists, Catholic musicians, Catholic composers, find themselves in some sense in the catacombs. And that's not necessarily a bad place to be. Certainly, what I find, I edit a magazine called the St. Austin Review. So I'm at the sort of hub of what's new in Catholic culture, the new writers, the new artists, the new musicians, the new composers. And over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a very significant increase in the amount of good art, literature, visual arts, music being produced by young Catholic artists. Now, they're not being part of the mainstream because the mainstream basically does not tolerate expressions of Catholicism. But what it is doing is enriching and nourishing the faithful and nurturing new generations of Catholic artists. Now, if we have to be in the underground for a while, that's fine if the underground is a place where really good and vibrant and exciting things are happening culturally and artistically. This is what I see is happening now. I think it's a very exciting time to be a Catholic. I'm very encouraged by what's going on out there. And we, against that, let's remember that we don't have to destroy the culture of death, because the culture of death is in the process of destroying itself. It's suicidal. So all we have to do is to hold on tight and be faithful and courageous while the ship of secularism sinks, and then we will see a great revival of interest in Catholicism as the only, if you like, lifeboat from a world that's sinking. Of course, we'll see that, and maybe 100, 200 years from now, we'll have a new rise of secularism, and the whole process will continue, because that's clearly what is the pattern of human history. It's the good of the saints, it's the bad of the wickedness of the worldly, and it's the beautiful of Catholic art. The good, the bad, and the beautiful. They're the three fabrics that weave their way through every century of human history until the time that God eventually, in his good time, brings down the final curtain.
Okay, thank you. And like just a little continuation of the question. Do you feel that this gap that I mentioned nowadays, that we all feel in Brazil, living there, and simply we know that we have a lack of presence in literature, but you also feel that in the United States, or you feel that this revival is already taking place and things are already there? Like a little bit of comparison of what's happening there in the United States.
If we went downstairs to my, I have books all over the house here, but downstairs I have my collection of contemporary Catholic fiction and contemporary Catholic poetry. And it takes up several shelves. And by contemporary, I mean since the turn of the 21st century, since 2000. So there's some very good fiction being written. There's some wonderful Catholic poets out there. There's also some wonderful Catholic artists out there. It's happening. The one thing which is for me frustrating is that there Catholics in the mainstream, well, not the mainstream, ordinary Catholics are largely unaware of this exciting Catholic cultural revival that's going on in their midst. In other words, they look to the New York Times bestseller books, bestseller list for what fiction they're going to buy, rather than keeping their eye on the handful of good, faithful Catholic publishers that are publishing these new works. And so part of what I'm trying to do through the St. Austin Review is serve as a catalyst to, if you like, make these wonderful contemporary works of Catholic art and literature accessible to ordinary Catholics by enabling them to know that they exist. And that's the problem. There's this disconnect between exciting things that are happening and the perception of many Catholics who are unaware of it. So that's the challenge, is to get Catholics to start actually engaging with the culture that Catholics are producing, and to spend less time engaging with the secular culture, which is poisonous.
With that, I think we end our row of questions, as we once said it. And Mr. Pearce, thank you very much on behalf of the Legion de Santa Cruz, Legion of the Holy Cross. We all hope that the insights you shared here today with us, and also your work, will bear numerous fruits to the Catholic thinking and social action. And we also hope to speak with you on another occasion. God bless you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and keep up the great work you are evidently doing there in Brazil. And if you let me have the link when this is posted, I'll share it on my own platforms over here in the States.
All right, we sure will. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.